SS Staff Sergeant Rokus Misch. Who was he? He was Hitler's homie. He was his bodyguard. He had done an interview with the Associated Press to tell us his insight into Hitler, a man that he had great affection for all the way to the end of his life.
As Hitler's empire crumbled into ruin, one man saw it all. Just steps from the dictator, he watched power decay into fear and madness. In those last moments, he witnessed what truly happened inside the bunker.
Adolf Hitler committed together with his wife Eva Braun, who he married just before that.
For decades, he stayed silent, until the truth he carried could no longer be buried. What he revealed shattered the image of Hitler, exposing the man hidden behind closed doors. Life inside Hitler's inner circle. Rokus Misch entered Hitler's world quietly, almost by accident. A young soldier from Silesia, wounded during the Polish campaign in 1939, he was reassigned after his recovery to something he didn't fully understand at the time. The Führerbegleitkommando, or FBK, Hitler's personal escort unit. The job sounded like a simple security detail, but it pulled him into a life where every sound was measured, every step controlled, and every secret deadly to know. By 1940, Misch's new world revolved around one man. The FBK operated as a wall around Hitler, a small group responsible for his safety, his travel, his messages, and his privacy. Misch's duties were routine yet critical, standing guard at Hitler's quarters, carrying sensitive documents, and operating the private telephone lines that connected the Führer to his ministers and generals. He wasn't part of strategy or ideology. His job was mechanical, precise, and silent. But that silence placed him closer to power than most men would ever stand. Daily life in Hitler's residences followed a strange rhythm. Misch moved between the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the Berghof High in the Bavarian Alps, and the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. Each location had its own atmosphere, the Wolf's Lair hidden deep in the forest, its wooden bunkers wrapped in camouflage netting and guarded by layers of SS patrols. The Berghof, bright and theatrical, with sweeping mountain views and visiting dignitaries. And the Chancellery, a labyrinth of marble corridors where Hitler's inner circle drifted in and out of meetings that shaped the war. Life inside these compounds was both orderly and suffocating. Hitler ruled not only through authority, but also through routine. Breakfast was late, discussions stretched for hours, and the workday often began when others were preparing to sleep. Misch watched the staff adjust their clocks to match Hitler's peculiar habits. He worked at night beside the communications room, waiting for calls from generals or foreign envoys, patching through messages that sometimes changed the course of battles he would never witness firsthand. To Misch, Hitler was courteous in private, even mild-mannered, far removed from the shouting speeches that filled newsreels. He spoke softly, avoided profanity, and maintained strict personal habits. The meals were vegetarian, and the drinks were non-alcoholic. Misch noticed how even high-ranking officers treated him with near-religious formality. No one interrupted him, no one sat until he did, and no one questioned an order. Conversations stopped when he entered the room. Every movement around him carried a sense of theater, as if everyone was performing the role expected of them. At the Berghof, the tone was deceptively casual. Hitler entertained guests, from generals to party leaders and foreign visitors, in the Great Hall or on the terrace overlooking the Alps. And Misch stood nearby, invisible but alert, hearing fragments of discussion without context. He saw Goebbels, always animated, Himmler, withdrawn and calculating, Bormann, ever-present and controlling, and Albert Speer, the architect who seemed to move between worlds, both confidant and servant. Misch was close enough to see the shifting alliances, the quiet competition for Hitler's attention, and the glances that revealed resentment or fear. But he remained an observer, never a participant. When Hitler retreated to the Wolf's Lair, the mood darkened. The forest seemed to swallow the compound, and the isolation pressed on everyone inside. The staff rarely saw daylight. Guards checked papers at every turn, and radio transmissions were coded and recoded to avoid interception. Misch's job became purely functional, operating the private switchboard, connecting Hitler's calls to Berlin, and relaying secure messages through guarded lines. The work demanded accuracy and patience. A single mistake could expose a conversation to enemy intelligence or earn suspicion from within. Amid the hierarchy and secrecy, Eva Braun brought a trace of normal life. Mischt recalled seeing her often at the upper floors of the Berghof, where she lived quietly, keeping a distance from the political discussions below. She photographed the staff, played music, and laughed easily with Hitler's secretaries. Few of the party's senior men acknowledged her presence. To them, she was an inconvenience, tolerated but excluded. Misch would later describe her as cheerful and loyal, a young woman who seemed determined to ignore the darkness around her. She treated the guards kindly. The longer Mischt served, the more he understood the unspoken rule that governed everyone near Hitler: obedience without question. Orders flowed downward, never upward. Decisions were made in small rooms behind closed doors, and even the closest aides understood only fragments of the larger plan. Misch's world was limited to his post, his duties, and his silence. Talking about what he saw was forbidden, not only by regulation, but also by instinct. Everyone feared that one careless sentence could destroy a career, or worse. But on July 20th, 1944, this illusion of control was shattered. A bomb detonated at the Wolf's Lair during a conference meeting. Misch wasn't inside the room, but he felt the blast ripple through the compound. The walls shook, and the phones went dead. For a few minutes, no one knew whether Hitler was alive. The guards ran through corridors, and the compound filled with shouts. But when the confusion cleared and word spread that Hitler had survived, the mood shifted from panic to hysteria. Relief turned into rage, and the search for traitors began instantly. In the aftermath, everything changed. Security tripled. Entrances were sealed, visitors screened, and guards interrogated about their loyalties. Mischt noticed how fear settled over the compound like fog. Officers whispered less, files disappeared overnight. Even the casual warmth between staff vanished. Every man looked over his shoulder, as the sense of loyalty that once held the circle together gave way to suspicion. Still, life went on as if routine could erase the fear. Hitler returned to work within hours of the explosion, his arm wounded, his demeanor cold. He spoke less in public, spent longer alone, and the meetings grew shorter and more irritable. Mischt continued to operate the telephones, connecting voices that no longer spoke with confidence. Through it all, Mischt stayed in his post, not from devotion, but from duty and the absence of choice. The FBK followed Hitler wherever he went, bound by their orders and the understanding that there was no transfer from this assignment. For years, his world was one of silence, strict schedules, and waiting for the next call, the next journey, and the next order. He didn't argue or analyze. He observed. And though he stood only a few steps away from absolute power, he existed entirely in its shadow. A man whose presence was essential, but whose voice was never heard. But as the war turned against Germany and the circle around Hitler began to shrink, those shadows grew darker, the orders grew fewer. The journeys stopped, and soon Misch's post would move underground, into the final fortress of a collapsing empire. Final days in the Berlin bunker. By the spring of 1945, the world around Rokas Misch had shrunk to a few concrete rooms buried beneath Berlin. The Führer bunker felt more like a tomb than a shelter. It was a maze of narrow corridors, steel doors, and stale air. The deeper one went, the less sense of time there was. Electric lamps burned around the clock, and the air smelled of smoke, fuel, and damp concrete. The walls quivered with every distant shell. Above them, the city was being erased street by street. Yet, below ground, Hitler's circle continued to follow its routines as if nothing could reach them. Mischt worked in the communications center at the heart of the bunker, maintaining Hitler's telephone lines even as the network collapsed piece by piece. The constant rumble of artillery pressed through the walls. Dust fell from the ceiling with each explosion, and the corridors trembled underfoot. Officers spoke in low voices, secretaries moved quickly, and the sound of typewriters mixed with the faint thud of falling bombs. In those final weeks, Hitler's decline became impossible to ignore. Misch saw him daily, not as the commanding figure from propaganda, but as a frail, exhausted man whose body no longer obeyed him. His hands reportedly trembled, his walk had become a shuffle, and his once rigid posture bent from fatigue. The meetings grew shorter, and his temper, once controlled, now shifted between silence and sudden anger. The few who still surrounded him treated him with a mixture of reverence and fear. He no longer trusted his generals, convinced that betrayal had crept into the ranks. Only Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann remained within his confidence. They hovered constantly at his side, whispering reports, reinforcing illusions of control, and shielding him from reality. Every dispatch that reached the bunker carried worse news, yet no one dared to deliver it plainly. Hitler clung to maps, tracing imaginary troop movements that no longer existed. To the men watching him, it was as though the war had already ended everywhere except inside that room. Among the few who still seemed untouched by despair was Eva Braun. She had refused every offer to leave Berlin, telling the staff she would never abandon him. Misch saw her move quietly through the bunker, composed and affectionate, determined to remain cheerful in a place where nothing hopeful remained. On April 29, 1945, she and Hitler were married in a brief civil ceremony inside one of the bunker's side rooms. The witnesses were Bormann and Goebbels, and the registrar arrived from outside under heavy shelling. Misch reportedly heard the quiet exchange of vows and the champagne toast that followed. For a moment, there was calm, almost dignity, before the silence returned. By the next day, April 30th, the end arrived with little warning. Around midday, Misch was at his post in the communications room when a single sharp sound echoed through the corridor, cutting through the distant rumble of bombardment. The guards froze, and for a moment, no one moved. Then Bormann's voice broke the silence, ordering the doors to be sealed. When Misch was finally allowed to enter, the scene was stark and final. Hitler sat slumped on the sofa, motionless, with a pistol nearby. Eva Braun lay beside him, still and quiet. The air hung heavy with the faint scent of gunpowder. The staff moved quickly under orders. The bodies were carried through the narrow passage to the Chancellery garden above, wrapped in blankets, and placed in a shell crater. Misch followed at a distance. The garden was filled with smoke, and as the flames rose, the small group stood back silently, watching the remains burn according to Hitler's instructions. Inside the bunker, shock gave way to emptiness. With Hitler gone, the remaining officers argued over what to do next. Goebbels declared that he would not flee, insisting that his loyalty would end only in death. The atmosphere sank into despair as the constant gunfire outside grew closer by the hour. Misch continued working at the switchboard, listening as line after line went dead. Berlin was falling apart, and their world was folding in on itself. That night brought one of the darkest moments of all, the Goebbels family tragedy. Magda Goebbels, devoted to the regime until the end, refused to let her 6 children live in what she called a world without National Socialism. With the help of the SS doctor Ludwig Stumpfegger, and reportedly with sedatives prepared by Helmut Kunz, she put the children to sleep before the fatal act. Misch did not witness it directly, but was present in the aftermath, when the quiet of the corridors told everyone what had happened. Soon after, Joseph and Magda Goebbels tragically passed away in the garden where Hitler's body had been burned the day before. From that moment, the bunker unraveled. The few remaining staff either fled, surrendered, or took desperate measures to destroy evidence. Misch received orders to destroy sensitive documents and equipment, clearing the communications room before Soviet troops could reach it. The once orderly compound dissolved into chaos, maps torn from walls, files scattered, and weapons abandoned in the halls. Misch would later describe those hours as a descent into madness, a world collapsing within itself, where discipline had vanished and survival became the only thought left. By the first days of May, the walls that had once felt unbreakable now seemed to close in with every blast above. Mish saw officers slipping away through side exits, hoping to break through Soviet lines. Bormann disappeared into the ruins, never to be seen alive again, and the telephones, once filled with voices of authority, went silent. The end of the bunker was not marked by ceremony or farewell, but by the sound of footsteps fading one by one. The empire that had once commanded continents now existed in a handful of rooms beneath the earth, its leaders gone, its ideology extinguished in smoke and dust. And as the bunker fell silent, Mish made the decision to flee the bunker that had swallowed the last breath of the regime, unaware that his own ordeal was only beginning. Escape, capture, and imprisonment. When Berlin finally fell, Rokas Mish knew the war had reached its end. The corridors of the Führerbunker were nearly empty now. Only a few guards, secretaries, and medical staff remained. On May 2, 1945, as Soviet forces advanced through the city, Mish and a handful of others, including Johannes Henschel, faced a choice: surrender or try to escape. They moved carefully through what was left of central Berlin. The streets were littered with debris, the air thick with smoke. Buildings stood as hollow shells. Mish had no grand plan. He only hoped to make it out alive. His group followed back routes toward the city's edge, but it was too late. The Red Army controlled nearly every sector. Within hours, they were surrounded and captured by Soviet troops. Mish was taken for interrogation. At first, his captors treated him like any other German soldier, but that changed the moment he revealed where he had served. The word Führerbunker drew immediate attention. Officers began questioning him about Hitler, about the final hours underground, and about whether the Führer was truly dead. Soviet intelligence, still uncertain and suspicious, was desperate for confirmation. Over the next several days, Mish answered the same questions repeatedly. He described what he had seen in the bunker: the constant shelling, the exhaustion, and the atmosphere of defeat. He told them about the gunshot that ended Hitler's life, about Eva Braun beside him, and about the burning of the remains in the garden above. Yet his answers never seemed to satisfy them. The Soviets wanted proof beyond testimony, and no one could provide it. Before long, Mish was reportedly transferred from Berlin to Moscow, where the interrogations continued inside Lubyanka prison, headquarters of the NKVD known as the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. His questioning there was longer, more methodical, and far harsher. Every session circled the same subject: could Hitler have escaped? Mish insisted that he had seen him dead, but his interrogators only viewed this as another possible lie. Conditions at Lubyanka were grim. Mish was confined in a small cell with minimal light, where food was poor and prisoners were kept under constant watch. The interrogations came without warning, sometimes in the middle of the night. He endured endless hours of questioning, repeating details, until exhaustion blurred his thoughts. Still, he maintained the same account. Hitler and Eva Braun had died together in the bunker on April 30th. By the end of 1946, the Soviet authorities had extracted what they could. With no further use for him in Moscow, Mish was sent east. His destination was Siberia, part of the vast network of labor camps where thousands of German prisoners were held after the war. In Siberia, life followed a strict rhythm of work, hunger, and cold. Mish labored under guard with other prisoners, many of them former soldiers, cutting timber, repairing roads, and hauling supplies. Winters were brutal, summers brief, and disease common. Letters were rare, and the prisoners had little contact with the outside world. Over time, the days began to lose distinction, as survival became routine. Mish spent 8 years in captivity under these conditions. He later spoke of the exhaustion, the hunger, and the relentless labor that defined those years. But he also had moments when endurance became its own form of resistance. He avoided punishment by following orders carefully and keeping to himself. In those years, he aged quickly and his body weakened. But his sense of discipline, instilled from years in military service, kept him steady. News from home filtered through slowly, By the early 1950s, the war had been over for nearly a decade, and Germany was no longer the country he had known. When Stalin died in 1953, the Soviet Union began releasing some long-term prisoners, and Misch was among them. After 8 years of captivity, he received his release papers and soon after boarded a train westward, passing again through the same landscape that had once held him prisoner. By the time he reached Berlin, the city had changed beyond recognition. Streets were rebuilt, walls divided the zones of occupation, and the faces he once knew were gone. Back home, he was reunited with his wife, Gerda, who had survived the war and remained in Berlin. Misch found work as a decorator and painter, rebuilding homes and offices in a city still marked by ruin. His military past remained largely unspoken. Few people asked, and he offered little explanation. In those first years after his return, Misch lived a restrained and private life. He avoided political discussions and rarely mentioned his time with Hitler. For him, the war belonged to another world that seemed distant, almost unreal in the new Germany taking shape around him. His experiences in the bunker and in the camps were memories he carried in silence, shared with no one outside his family. Still, the past never fully disappeared. In the 1950s and 60s, stories about Hitler's final days began to circulate widely. Journalists, historians, and former soldiers all offered their own versions of what had happened beneath the chancellery. Many accounts conflicted, and rumors persisted that Hitler had escaped Berlin altogether. But for Misch, who had seen the scene firsthand, such speculation was both frustrating and painful because he knew what he had witnessed. Through those years, he chose not to involve himself in public debate. Instead, he focused on his business, kept his routine, and raised a family. His past remained locked away until the fading of his generation finally brought him to reconsider silence. By the time Misch reached old age, most of the men who had shared the bunker with him were gone. He had outlived them all, the generals, the adjutants, and even the secretaries. And as journalists and filmmakers began to revisit the war's final chapter, they sought out the man who carried first-hand memories of those final days. After years of silence, the man who had stood outside Hitler's private office finally broke his own. But what he revealed about those final days and what he refused to say would ignite debate for decades to come. Post-war life and public testimony. After returning to Berlin in the 1950s, Rochus Misch lived quietly, determined to disappear into ordinary life. The war had left him with scars that were both visible and unspoken. He knew that his name, if connected publicly to the Führer bunker, could bring questions, suspicion, and perhaps even prosecution. And he never joined any veteran or political organizations. In a divided Germany, where memories of the war still ran deep and the wounds of Nazism were far from healed, he chose anonymity. Those years of quiet suited him. The new Germany was moving forward, and he had no interest in revisiting the past. Former SS members often faced social rejection and legal scrutiny, and Misch wanted neither. He feared being drawn into politics, questioned about things beyond his control, or accused of loyalty to a cause that had long since collapsed. In his view, he had simply been a soldier who followed orders, one small figure in a vast machine. For half a century, he lived this way, working, aging, watching history reshape itself around him. But then, as the 1990s and early 2000s approached, Misch began granting occasional interviews, speaking cautiously about his experiences to journalists and filmmakers. His recollections were straightforward, often matter-of-fact, and rarely emotional. He described daily routines in the bunker, the tone of life around Hitler, and the structure of the Führer's staff. He insisted that he had never been involved in politics and that his duties were limited to communications and courier work. For some, this perspective made him seem credible, a man recalling what he saw without embellishment, while for others, it felt like evasion. In 2008, at 91 years old, Misch finally published his memoir in Germany. The book offered a detailed account of his service from the early war years through the collapse in Berlin. It was later released in English under the title I Was Hitler's Bodyguard, around 2014, translated and circulated internationally. The memoir became a source for historians and documentary producers, offering first-hand descriptions of life inside the Führer's inner circle. Alongside the book, Misch continued to appear in interviews with international outlets, including the BBC, Reuters, and major German networks. His manner remained calm, almost detached, as he spoke of events that had defined the 20th century. When asked about his feelings toward Hitler, Misch's words often unsettled audiences. He described his former commander in ordinary terms that were disciplined, polite, and private, and he seemed unwilling to express the hatred or moral condemnation many expected. He also repeated that during his years of service, he had neither seen nor heard of the atrocities that later defined Nazi rule. These remarks stirred strong reactions. Historians noted that while Misch had not served in the field or in administrative offices tied to Nazi policy, his proximity to power made complete ignorance difficult to accept. Survivors and critics accused him of minimizing evil by portraying Hitler as merely human. Misch, however, rarely engaged with the controversy. He said little beyond the facts he believed he could personally attest to, leaving judgment to others. Despite the backlash, his recollections were widely used by filmmakers and researchers seeking accuracy in depictions of Hitler's final days. He contributed commentary to several documentary projects, including The Last Witness and Hitler's Circle of Evil. He also praised the 2004 film Downfall for what he regarded as its realistic portrayal of the bunker, from the dim rooms to the exhaustion and the sense of inevitable defeat that had consumed those final weeks. Public opinion about Misch remained divided. Some journalists regarded him as a unique historical witness, whose presence preserved details that might otherwise have vanished. Others viewed him as emblematic of a generation of Germans unwilling to confront the full moral weight of the regime they had served. In academic circles, his testimony was analyzed less for emotional insight than for factual corroboration. Small confirmations about who was present, how orders were delivered, and what the final atmosphere had been like underground. What unsettled many was not simply what Misch said, but how he said it. His tone was never defensive, yet rarely remorseful. He appeared to see himself outside of ideology, a bystander to history rather than a participant. To those who had suffered under Nazi rule, this detachment felt like denial. To Misch, it was plain honesty. He spoke only about what he had personally witnessed, refusing to comment on anything beyond his direct experience. Over time, he became something of an unlikely public figure, a man who had once lived in silence, now fielding questions from historians and documentarians around the world. Yet, his personal life changed little. He continued to live in the same modest house in Berlin, the very home he had first moved into with Goethe in 1938. Insider reports say it's filled with photographs, keepsakes, and reminders of an earlier era. Misch himself remained physically active even in old age, answering letters and requests for interviews well into his 90s. The moral debate surrounding him never really faded. Some felt that Misch's long silence and later candor had value, and that he provided a human glimpse into the machinery of dictatorship, neither glorifying nor sensationalizing it. But others argued that by refusing to condemn Hitler outright, he blurred the line between testimony and justification. His story became a study in how memory, guilt, and history intertwine when the witness is neither victim nor architect, but something in between. In the final years of his life, Misch appeared to accept that controversy would follow him. He spoke less frequently, but when he did, his tone carried the weariness of someone who had outlived everyone he once knew. The men who had shared the bunker were long gone, but he remained to answer the questions the world still asked. On September 5, 2013, Rokus Misch died in Berlin at the age of 96. His passing was widely reported across international media as the death of the last known survivor of Hitler's inner circle. To many, it marked the closing of a chapter that had begun nearly 70 years earlier, in the war's final days. In death, Misch left behind a complicated legacy. A man defined by proximity to power, yet claiming no part in its crimes. A witness whose testimony bridged the space between history and moral reckoning. His memoir and interviews continue to appear in documentaries and archives, ensuring that his quiet, limited, and contested version of events remains part of the historical record. For the historians who studied him, Misch's life offered no absolution, only perspective. He was neither the villain some accused him of being, nor the innocent observer he believed himself to be. He was, instead, a reminder that history often survives through those caught in its margins, the ones who were present, watching, while the world turned on decisions they could not change. Do you believe Rochus Misch's account of Hitler's behavior behind closed doors? Drop your answers in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.